The heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the land and bent the will of everything living beneath it. It shimmered in waves off the caked, cracked earth of the town square, distorted the distant mesas into wobbling apparitions, and baked the very silence into a brittle, ringing drone. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated every surface, a pale shroud over the cynical, sun-bleached town of Redemption. And at the heart of this oppressive stillness, in the town's central corral, was a circle of men. They stood with the lazy, proprietary slouch of vultures, their hats tipped low against the white glare of the afternoon sun, their gazes fixed on the drama unfolding within the weathered pine rails. They weren't watching a rodeo or a sale. They were watching a death. Clarabelle Clara knelt in that dust. It stained the knees of her worn denim trousers, worked its way into the creases of her knuckles, and mingled with the sweat on her brow to trace gritty rivulets down her temples. Her world had shrunk to the space occupied by the dying horse, a magnificent ruin of an animal sprawled in the dirt. His coat, the color of a storm cloud, was matted with sweat, filth, and blood from a deep, ragged wound on his flank, a gash that pulsed with a life that was alarmingly, inexorably seeping away. His breathing was a shallow, tortured rasp, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a surrender. The men called him scrap, a waste of good pasture, a bullet's charity. Clara called him Thunderheart. The name had come to her in the first moment she saw him, a flicker of the immense power that must have once lived in that great chest, now just a failing bellows. Her hands were steady on his hide, moving with a slow, deliberate tenderness that was a direct affront to the hostile pragmatism surrounding her. One hand rested on his neck, her thumb stroking the coarse mane, trying to impart a sense of peace that she herself did not feel. The other worked with a damp rag, cleaning the edges of the wound with a meticulous care that bordered on prayer. The water in her bucket, once clear, was now a murky pink. It was the last of her water, and the town well was a long, hot walk away, a walk she would have to endure under the scalpel of public opinion. "Still playing nursemaid to a ghost, Clara?" The voice was a rusty saw cutting through the shimmering air. Silas Ward. He leaned against the top rail of the corral, one dusty boot hooked on a lower rung, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. A toothpick danced in the corner of his mouth, a jaunter punctuation to his sneer. He was a man carved from the hard parts of the world, rock, leather, and a core of unyielding, cynical realism. To him, compassion was a currency for fools, and sentiment was a disease. Clara didn't look up. To acknowledge him would be to give his words purchase, to let the acid of his mockery seep into the fragile sanctuary she was trying to build around the horse. "He's not a ghost yet, Silas." Her voice was low, rough with dust and exhaustion, but it held a spine of steel. Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that drew murmurs of agreement from the other ranchers. "Might as well be. Look at him, legs busted, gut shot by the look of it. Coyote bait waitin' to happen. You're wasting your time and good water. A man's got to be practical in this country. Life's hard. You don't coddle what's already dead." "He's not dead," she screamed in the echoing chamber of her own mind. Her fingers pressed a little harder into the horse's neck, a desperate, tactile argument against Silas's verdict. She could feel it, couldn't she? The faint, stubborn tremor of life beneath the skin. A warmth that wasn't just the sun. A pulse, thready and weak as a moth's wing. But there, it was there. I feel it. "What's the point, Clara?" Another man called out, his voice less cruel than genuinely baffled. "He can't be ridden, can't be sold. He's just meat, and spoiled meat at that." Clara finally lifted her head, her gaze sweeping over the ring of faces. They were hard faces, weathered by sun and disappointment, men who understood the world through a brutal arithmetic of profit and loss. They saw a liability, a drain on resources, a failure. She saw a life, a creature of immense beauty and spirit, brought low by a cruelty it couldn't comprehend. She saw a family, somewhere out in the vast, indifferent wilderness, missing one of its own. "The point," she said, her voice carrying across the corral with newfound strength, "is that he's breathing. And as long as he's breathing, he's not worthless." Her defiance hung in the air, a strange and unwelcome note in the town's chorus of practicality. Silas pushed off the fence, spitting the toothpick into the dust. He squinted at her, his eyes cold and appraising, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He saw a woman in her late 20s, her face smudged with dirt, her honey-blonde hair escaping its braid in sweaty tendrils. He saw a foolishness he couldn't abide, a softness that was a danger in a place like this. Her empathy was, to him, a kind of madness. "Suit yourself," he drawled, turning away with a dismissive wave. "Place your bets, boys. I give him till sundown. A $1 says the coyotes get him before the fever does." The men laughed, their voices a gravelly wave of consensus that washed over Clara, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. They began to drift away in 2s and 3s, heading for the shade of the saloon porch, their morbid curiosity sated for the moment. Their judgment, however, lingered. It clung to the air like the heat, a suffocating presence. She was alone now, truly alone, kneeling in the dirt in a dusty arena of public ridicule, her hands on a horse everyone else had already buried. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. Thunderheart let out a shuddering sigh, a sound that was half pain, half exhaustion. Clara leaned her forehead against his warm, trembling flank and whispered into the matted hair, a promise to him and to the silent, watching sky. "I'm not leaving you." The day bled away in shades of heat and dust. The sun arced across the immense empty sky, a relentless eye tracking Clara's solitary vigil. The shadows of the corral posts stretched and warped, long dark fingers crawling across the baked earth. The last of the curious onlookers, children with wide, solemn eyes and women who whispered behind their hands, had retreated from the oppressive heat, leaving Clara to her stubborn, lonely work. She used the last of the pink-tinged water to moisten the horse's lips, a gesture of comfort that felt painfully inadequate. Her own throat was a desert, her lips cracked and peeling. The metallic taste of dust was a permanent coating on her tongue. The town pump felt a world away, not because of the distance, but because of the gauntlet of gazes she would have to run. She could already hear the whispers, the clicks of tongues, the pitying shakes of heads. That foolish Clara Henderson, wasting her strength on a lost cause. It was Martha Henderson's voice that echoed loudest in her mind. Martha, the town's primary news source and social arbiter, had made a special trip to the corral fence earlier, her face a mask of pinched concern that barely concealed her ravenous appetite for gossip. "Clarabelle, honey," she had cooed, fanning her face with a folded circular. "This is just, well, it's not proper. A woman, out here in the sun, with that." She'd gestured vaguely at Thunderheart, as if he were a piece of particularly unpleasant refuse. "Silas is right. It's a waste. You'll catch your death of heat stroke, and for what? The animal is suffering. The kindest thing would be a bullet." "Kindness is not the same as convenience, Martha," Clara had replied, her voice flat, her eyes never leaving the horse. The remark had clearly stung. Martha's concern had curdled into something sharper. "Well, don't come crying to me when you collapse. The whole town is talking. They think you've finally gone soft in the head, spending all that time alone since your father—" She'd let the sentence hang, a poisoned dart. The mention of her father was a low blow, and they both knew it. He was the one who had taught her that every life had its own song, and it was a person's duty to listen, especially to the faint ones. He had been a man of quiet compassion in a loud, hard world, and since his passing 2 years ago, Clara felt his absence like a missing limb. Martha and the others saw his legacy in Clara as a weakness to be exploited or corrected. Now, hours later, Martha's words, the town's words, circled in Clara's exhausted mind. Soft in the head, a lost cause, a waste. Doubt was a patient predator, and in the silence and the heat, it began to stalk the edges of her resolve. Was she a fool? Was this entire act a monument to her own stubborn pride? She looked at the horse, at the utter stillness of his great form, and a cold wave of despair washed through her. The rise and fall of his chest was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just prolonging his agony, drawing out a foregone conclusion for some selfish, sentimental reason she couldn't even name. Her body ached. Her knees were raw from the gritty earth. A dizzying headache pulsed behind her eyes. She slumped back against the rough pine of the corral fence, closing her eyes against the glare. The world swam in a red haze behind her eyelids. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine giving up, walking away, letting Silas and his cold logic win. The thought brought a strange, hollow relief, followed immediately by a surge of self-loathing that was sharp and bitter as bile. No, she couldn't. It wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was a stand against the casual cruelty, the lazy, expedient nihilism that had taken root in her town. To walk away would be to agree with them, to concede that life was only valuable when it was useful. It would be a betrayal of her father's memory, and a betrayal of the small, fierce kernel of belief she guarded within herself. As if in answer to her thoughts, a sound broke the stillness, a soft, wet snort. Clara's eyes snapped open. She leaned forward, every sense straining. Thunderheart's head, which had been lying limp in the dust, had lifted a bare inch off the ground. His one visible eye, cloudy with pain, rolled toward her. A tremor ran through his massive shoulder. It was a small thing, a flicker of movement in a sea of stillness. But to Clara, it was a thunderclap. "That's it," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. She scrambled back to his side on her hands and knees, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles. "That's it, boy. You're still in there." She dipped the rag into the dregs of the bucket, more mud than water now, and gently dabbed at his muzzle. He let out another, stronger breath, a weak gust of air against her hand. His ear twitched, flicking away a fly. Another sign, a tiny flag of defiance planted in the territory of death. Hope, which had been a distant flickering candle, flared into a bonfire in her chest. It burned away the exhaustion, the doubt, the echoing voices of the town. This was real. This was a fight. And it wasn't over. As the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, a new figure appeared at the corral. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's veterinarian, walked with the careful, deliberate steps of a man whose joints had catalogued a lifetime of seasons. He carried a worn leather bag, and his face, etched with the fine lines of kindness and weariness, held a gentle concern that was worlds away from Martha's invasive pity. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't stop at the fence but unlatched the gate and came inside, setting his bag down in the dust. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply began to offer it. "Let's have a look at our patient." He knelt opposite her, his old knees popping in protest. His hands, though gnarled with age, were surprisingly gentle as he examined the horse. He checked the wound, his brow furrowed in concentration. He listened to the horse's heart with a stethoscope, his eyes closed. For a long time, he was silent. Clara held her breath, bracing for a verdict that might shatter her newfound hope. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers over the horse's still form. "He's a fighter," Dr. Hayes said, and the simple words were a balm to Clara's frayed spirit. "Fever's high, wound is deep. Infection is the enemy now. The leg, it's a bad break, but his heart, it's still beating strong, stubbornly so." He pulled a syringe and a small bottle from his bag. "This is a broad-spectrum antibiotic. It's a long shot, Clara. A damn long shot, but it's better than nothing." He administered the injection with practiced ease. "And this," he said, handing her a small tin of dark, pungent salve, "is a poultice. Keep the wound clean and apply this. It'll help draw out the poison." He then took a canteen from his belt and handed it to her. "And this is for the nurse. You can't help him if you collapse." Clara took it, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Samuel." The words felt small, insufficient for the immense gift of his validation. He wasn't just offering medical aid, he was offering belief. He was the one other person in this entire town who was willing to stand on the side of a chance, no matter how slim. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a sad smile. "The night will be the test, for both of you." He looked past her, toward the lights beginning to twinkle on in the saloon. "Silas and the council are meeting tonight. They're talking about what to do with the nuisance in the town corral." A cold dread settled in Clara's stomach. "They can't. They think they can," Dr. Hayes said, his voice grim. "They see a problem to be disposed of. Be ready, Clara. Pragmatism can be a cruel and impatient god." He gave her shoulder a light squeeze, a silent gesture of solidarity, and then he was gone, a stooped figure retreating into the deepening twilight. Clara was alone again, but not as she had been before. She had medicine, she had water, and she had the confirmation that the life she was fighting for was, indeed, still fighting for itself. Night fell, not as a gentle blanket, but as a vast, cold presence. The desert air, stripped of the sun's heat, grew teeth. A sliver of moon cast a pale, skeletal light over the landscape, rendering the world in shades of silver and black. In the corral, the darkness was thick and absolute, broken only by the warm yellow squares of light from the town's windows and the distant, raucous sounds of the saloon. The bets and judgments she'd heard earlier seemed to echo in the chill air, ghostly taunts in the quiet. Clara worked by the faint moonlight, her movements slow and ritualistic. She cleaned the wound as best she could and applied the doctor's pungent salve. She spoke to the horse in a low, continuous murmur, telling him stories of the open range, of sweet grass and cool water, of the wind running like a river through a wild mane. She didn't know if he could understand or even hear her, but the sound of her own voice kept the encroaching loneliness at bay. It was a shield against the vast, silent indifference of the night. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Her eyelids felt weighted with lead. She leaned her back against Thunderheart's flank, drawing a sliver of warmth from his body. The ground was cold and hard, the air sharp in her lungs. She must have dozed, because she was startled awake by a sound, a groan, low and deep from the animal beside her. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. He was shifting. Not just an involuntary twitch, but a deliberate, agonized movement. His front legs scraped against the dirt as he tried to bunch them under him. His neck arched, muscles straining, cords standing out like ropes. He was trying to stand. The effort was immense, a titanic struggle against gravity, injury, and crushing weakness. He rose a few inches, his great head lifting from the dust, and then, with a shuddering sigh, he collapsed again. Failure. But what a magnificent failure it was. "It's okay," Clara breathed, her hand finding his neck in the darkness. "It's okay. You tried." A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching pride. He was a fighter. Dr. Hayes was right. He had not surrendered, and in that moment, she knew she would not surrender either. She would stay through the night, through 1,000 nights if she had to. She would be his strength when his own failed. She would be his vigil. It was then that she saw them, the approaching lights. Not the warm, steady lamps of homes, but the bobbing, weaving dance of lanterns held aloft. They moved with purpose, converging on the corral from the direction of the town hall. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the dry ground followed, accompanied by the low, grim murmur of men's voices. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in Clara's belly. They were coming, Silas and the council, and they were not coming to talk. The lantern lights sliced through the darkness, casting long, menacing shadows that writhed and danced like demons. The pine rails of the corral threw a cage of black bars across the ground, trapping Clara and the horse in their grid. Silas Ward was at the front, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Behind him were the other members of the town council, a blacksmith, a merchant, a landowner, their faces set and grim in the flickering orange glow. They looked less like civic leaders and more like a posse, a tribunal of expediency ready to pass sentence. Silas stopped just outside the gate, his boots planting him with an air of unshakable authority. His shadow loomed over Clara, a giant of pragmatic malice. "All right, Clara, this has gone on long enough." His voice was flat, stripped of its earlier mockery, now holding the cold, hard tone of a final verdict. "The animal is a public nuisance and a health hazard. It's suffering. We're putting it out of its misery." Clara got to her feet slowly, her body a single, stiff ache of protest. She moved to stand between the men and the horse, her slight frame a ridiculously fragile barrier against their grim purpose. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the night's silence. "You will not," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You will not touch him." The merchant, a portly man named Abernathy, shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Clara, be reasonable. We all respect your sentiment. But Silas is right. It's the kindest thing to do." "You call this kindness?" Clara shot back, her voice ringing with a fury that surprised even herself. She gestured wildly at the rifle in Silas's hand. "Coming here in the dead of night, like thieves, to kill a creature that's fighting for its own life? You know nothing of kindness. This is about tidiness, about not wanting to be bothered by something that makes you uncomfortable." Silas scoffed, taking a step toward the gate. "I'm not going to argue semantics with a sentimental girl. He's dying. We're just hurrying it along. Now step aside." "No." The word was small, but it landed with the force of a slammed door. Clara planted her feet, her arms spread slightly, a human shield. She could feel Thunderheart's warmth at her back, the slow, rhythmic puff of his breath against her legs. She was no longer just his nursemaid, she was his guardian. In that moment, she would have faced down a charging bull for him. Silas's face hardened, his patience gone. He made a curt gesture to the blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Gus. "Open the gate!" Gus hesitated, his gaze flicking from Silas's unforgiving expression to Clara's desperate, defiant stand. For a heartbeat, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But the pressure to conform, the weight of Silas's will, was too strong. He moved toward the latch. "Don't you dare!" Clara cried out, her voice raw with desperation. This was it. The breaking point. The standoff was no longer about words. It was about to become physical. Silas was raising the rifle, not to aim it, but to use it to push her aside. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like static electricity on the skin. The world narrowed to this single terrible moment. The heavy boot, the cold steel, the inevitable end. And then from the horse behind her came a sound. It was not a groan of pain or a sigh of defeat. It was a call. A weak, reedy whinny, thin and cracked with strain, but piercing the night with a desperate, hopeful question. It was the voice of a lost child calling for its mother. For a second, everyone froze. Silas lowered the rifle slightly, a look of confusion on his face. The men exchanged uncertain glances. The sound was so unexpected, so full of plaintive life, that it momentarily broke the spell of their grim mission. Clara felt a sob catch in her throat. He was calling. After all this time, he was calling out, and the darkness answered. From the vast, black emptiness of the plains beyond the town, a sound rolled back. It was not a weak whinny, but a powerful, resonant call, a trumpet blast that shattered the night's silence. It was a sound of primal authority, of unshakable strength, a deep-chested nicker that spoke of wind and rock and untamed spaces. It was the voice of a king answering his subject, a parent answering their child. Every head jerked toward the sound. The councilmen's lanterns swung around, their beams cutting frantic, searching arcs into the darkness beyond the corral. What they saw silenced them completely. At the far fence line, where the pale moonlight met the edge of the world, figures were emerging from the liquid dark. They were spectral shapes at first, apparitions born of shadow and starlight. Then the lantern light caught them, and they resolved into solid forms. Horses, a herd of wild horses. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, formidable wall of animal presence. Their coats shone like polished obsidian and dusky silver in the shifting light. Their eyes, dozens of them, glowed with a green and gold fire, fixed on the corral. At their head stood a stallion, a magnificent creature of midnight black, his neck arched, his nostrils flared. He was the one who had answered. He stood like a sentinel, a statue of wild vigilance, his gaze locked on the men with an intelligence that felt ancient and unnervating. Beside him was a lead mare, her coat the color of cream, her expression one of fierce maternal concern. She took a step forward, then another, her soft muzzle twitching, her ears pricked toward the corral, toward the source of the weak, plaintive call. The town, and the men who ran it, had been built on the principle of taming the wild, of fencing it in and bending it to their will. Now the wild had come to their doorstep. It hadn't come with thunder or fury, but with a quiet, unnerving power that was far more intimidating. It had come to answer a call they hadn't even believed had the strength to be uttered. The standoff was shattered. The petty human drama of rifles and rules and pragmatic cruelty evaporated in the face of this silent, awesome arrival. Silas Ward, the man of hard facts and practical solutions, stood speechless, his rifle hanging limply at his side. He stared at the wild herd, his cynical realism failing him for the first time in his life. He was confronted with a force he could not bully, a logic he could not comprehend. Clara turned slowly, her gaze shifting from the stunned faces of the men to the luminous eyes of the herd. She looked down at Thunderheart. He was trying to lift his head again, his whinny now a soft, continuous rumble in his chest, a homing beacon that had miraculously found its mark. The air in the corral no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary, protected by a silent, powerful family that had emerged from the darkness. The nature of the conflict had been utterly transformed. It was no longer Clara against the town. It was the fragile, stubborn hope of one small circle against the unbreakable, primal bond of the wild. And for the first time all day, Clara felt she was on the winning side. Dawn broke not with a sudden crack, but with a slow, seeping grace, the black of the night diluting to a deep, bruised indigo, then to a soft gray. A thin line of pale gold appeared on the eastern horizon, backlighting the mesas and gilding the edges of the wild herd, which had not moved. They remained in their silent, unwavering vigil, a living fence of kinship just beyond the man-made one. The night-long standoff had settled into a tense, surreal tableau. Inside the corral, Clara sat beside Thunderheart, her exhaustion a deep, resonant hum in her bones, but her spirit strangely calm. Outside, the councilmen had retreated a few paces, their bravado from the night before completely gone, replaced by a sullen, watchful confusion. They were men out of their depth, their authority rendered meaningless by a power they couldn't legislate or shoot. This fragile truce was shattered by the rhythmic beat of shod hooves on the hard-packed dirt road leading into town. The sound was crisp, orderly, and official. It was the sound of the law. A man on a sturdy bay horse rode into the square, followed by 2 deputies. He wore a dusty coat and a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Thomas Crawford had the look of a man who dealt in problems and their solutions, his face a roadmap of weary competence. He had been summoned by one of the councilmen in the dead of night, a final appeal to a higher, more potent authority. He was here to solve the problem of the wild horses disrupting the peace. He reined in his horse, his gaze taking in the scene with a practiced, assessing sweep. The exhausted woman in the corral, the wounded animal on the ground, the cluster of defeated-looking town leaders, and finally, the silent, imposing line of wild horses. He dismounted, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in the charged silence. "Silas," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Got your message. Seems you've got yourself a situation." Silas Ward, finding his voice again now that a familiar form of power had arrived, stepped forward. "Marshal, thank God, this has gotten out of hand. That woman," he gestured at Clara with undisguised contempt, "has been obstructing us all night. And now, this." He swept his arm toward the wild herd. "They're a menace. They need to be driven off before someone gets hurt." Marshal Crawford's eyes narrowed as he studied the herd. He saw not a menace, but a complication. Wild horses were a federal matter, a tangle of jurisdictions and paperwork he had no desire to unravel before breakfast. His job was to maintain order, and this scene was the very definition of disorder. He walked to the corral fence, his gaze falling on Clara. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm Marshal Crawford. I understand your attachment to the animal, but these men are right. This situation is untenable. We can't have a wild herd laying siege to the town. My deputies and I are going to have to drive them off. And for the animal's own good," he glanced at Thunderheart, his expression clinical, "the most humane thing is to put him down." This was the final, ultimate threat. It came not with the hot-headed malice of Silas, but with the cold, impersonal weight of official decree. Crawford was not a villain. He was worse. He was the system, an external force that would crush this small, sacred miracle under the boot heel of procedure and order. Clara rose to her feet, her whole body trembling with a mixture of fatigue and fury. "You can't," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. "Don't you see what's happening here? They came for him. His family came for him." The marshal sighed, a sound of profound bureaucratic weariness. "Ma'am, I see a pack of unpredictable animals and a wounded horse that needs to be put out of its misery. It's a sad thing, but it's the way of the world. Now, for the last time, please step away from the animal." He motioned to his deputies, who dismounted and began to unholster their rifles, not to shoot, but to use the noise and their presence to spook the herd. The end was here. The final curtain. The sound of a rifle butt tapping against a fence post, sharp and loud, was the signal. The lead mare of the wild herd tossed her head, snorting in alarm. The sentinel stallion shifted his weight, his muscles bunching, coiling for either flight or battle. And at that sound, at that moment of ultimate threat, something impossible happened. Thunderheart moved. He was not just shifting or twitching, he was fighting, drawing on some hidden primal reservoir of strength, fueled by the presence of his kin and the imminent danger they faced. He began to struggle to his feet. His first attempt was a groan-filled heave that barely lifted his shoulders from the dust. He collapsed back, his breath hissing through his teeth. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Get up," she prayed, the words a silent, frantic scream. "Please, get up." He tried again, his forelegs trembling violently, scraped for purchase. He pushed, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The wounded hind leg was a dead weight, an anchor of agony. He managed to get to his knees, his great head hanging low, his body shaking uncontrollably. For a moment he balanced there, a statue of pure, agonizing effort. Everyone watched. The world stopped. The deputies froze, their rifles forgotten. Silas Ward's mouth hung agape, his certainty utterly annihilated. Marshal Crawford stood motionless, his mask of weary authority cracking to reveal the stunned man beneath. The entire town, which had begun to creep out of their homes to witness the final act, stood in a silent, reverent circle, their morning gossip and judgments dissolving into breathless awe. The act of watching, which had begun with mockery, was now transformed into a sacred, shared witness. The lead mare in the distance let out a soft, encouraging nicker. It was a sound of pure love, a call across the space telling him come home. That sound was the final key. Drawing one last, shuddering breath, Thunderheart pushed upward. His bad leg scraped, threatening to buckle, but somehow, impossibly, it held. With a final convulsive surge of will, he was standing, unsteady, trembling, covered in dirt and blood, a ruin of a horse held together by sheer spirit. But he was on his feet. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a sound of disbelief, of wonder, of a hard-shelled, cynical world cracking open to reveal the possibility of a miracle. Thunderheart stood for a long moment, swaying, his head low. Then, slowly, painfully, he took a step. And another. He was walking. Each step was a masterpiece of controlled agony, a testament to the profound power of belonging. He was not walking toward Clara. He was not walking toward the men. He was walking toward the gate, toward the sound of his family. The climax was not a gunshot or a shout. It was this walk, this slow, painful, and impossibly triumphant journey across the dusty corral. It was the sound of his hooves, hesitant but determined, on the packed earth. It was the sight of his own will providing the resolution that no lawman or rancher could. Nature was providing its own answer, and it left every human being in that space in a state of stunned, humbled silence. Clara moved as if in a dream, her body acting without conscious thought. She walked to the gate, her eyes locked on the approaching horse. Her hand, steady now, reached for the wooden latch. She didn't look at the marshal. She didn't look at Silas. She looked only at Thunderheart, his magnificent, broken, and utterly unconquerable spirit. She lifted the latch. The gate swung open with a soft creak, a sound that echoed the opening of a tomb, the release of a prisoner, the drawing of a final sacred breath. The space was clear. The path was open. Thunderheart did not hesitate. He walked through the gateway, leaving the dusty arena of his suffering behind him. He was leaving the human world, with its judgments and its pity and its laws, and returning to his own. The lead mare moved forward to meet him, her steps slow and deliberate. There was no loud, dramatic reunion. There was only a profound and tender silence. She touched his muzzle with her own, a soft, breathy greeting. She nuzzled the side of his neck, her eyes soft, and then began to gently lick his wounded flank, a mother cleaning her child's hurt. The great sentinel stallion came to his other side, a dark, protective shadow flanking him. Another mare and a young colt moved in behind, completing the circle. They enveloped him, a living fortress of family, shielding him from the world of men. For a long moment, they stood there, a tableau of reunion against the vast canvas of the rising sun. Then, as one, the herd turned. They began to move away, slowly, deliberately, accommodating Thunderheart's pained, limping gait. They did not run. They walked with a regal and unhurried grace, a silent procession moving off into the immense golden landscape, swallowing him back into the heart of the wild from which he had come. Clara stood at the open gate, her hand still resting on the wood. She watched them go, her gaze following them until they were just small, dark specks against the shimmering horizon, and then nothing at all. The corral behind her was empty, a circle of silent, trampled dust. The ache of his absence was a sudden physical pang in her chest, sharp and deep. It was loss. But mingled with it was a feeling so profound, so vast, it almost took her breath away. It was not triumph, not victory, but a quiet, resonant peace, a sense of rightness. The silence that had fallen over the town was different now. It was no longer the silence of judgment or confusion, but of awe. The spell was broken by a small sound beside her. Martha Henderson stood there, her face stripped of its usual gossipy animation, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. In her hands, she held out a tin canteen. "Clara," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you must be thirsty." Clara took the water, her gaze meeting Martha's. In that simple gesture, an offering without caveat or judgment, she saw the shift. A small, hard kernel of cynicism in the heart of the town had been cracked open. She looked past Martha to the others. Marshal Crawford slowly, deliberately holstered his pistol, a look of deep reflection on his face. He nodded once at Clara, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect, then turned and mounted his horse, riding away, without a word. Silas Ward stood alone, staring at the empty gate, his rifle hanging uselessly in his hand. He was not angry. He looked smaller, diminished, a man whose entire understanding of the world had been dismantled in the space of a single sunrise. He had seen something that could not be measured in dollars or utility, and the sight had left him bankrupt. Clara walked to the center of the empty corral, the canteen cool and heavy in her hand. She unscrewed the cap and drank deeply, the water a blessed relief on her parched throat. The sun was higher now, its warmth gentle on her skin. The dust had settled. The air was clean. She was alone, surrounded by the evidence of the struggle. The scuffed earth, the discarded bloody rags, the lingering scent of salve and horse. She had fought for a life, and in the end, had let it go. She hadn't won a horse. She had won something far more intangible and precious. She had held the line for compassion against a tide of pragmatism, and had witnessed belief made manifest. She had restored a creature not to health, but to home. Standing there in the quiet aftermath, Clara felt the profound ache of her exhaustion, the sting of her raw knees, the hollowness of her loss. But beneath it all, there was a deep, unshakable peace. It was the peace of a battle hard fought and rightly ended. It was the peace of letting go. She tipped her head back, closing her eyes against the golden light, feeling the gentle breeze on her face. She had stood her ground, one woman against a town, for a life everyone else had deemed worthless. And in winning that battle, not by possessing, but by liberating, she had won back a piece of her own soul, and perhaps a piece of her town's as well. The horizon was vast and empty, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of promise.